On this week's episode of the Green Building Matters podcast, we've actually taken some of our sustainability challenge education and we've pulled out some hot topics. First, we're going to zoom out and talk about kind of the state of the Sustainability Union, even some really big mandates from certain countries around the world, all the way down to some local laws in certain cities. And just, where are we at with our buildings and their impact on our overall greenhouse gas emissions? Next, we're going to go and give you some of the latest cliff notes on LEED updates, well updates, Fitwel, and even GRESB. How green is your portfolio? Let's make sure you have some talking points there here in late 2022. And then third, we have to continue to revisit the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. We've pulled in a couple subject matter experts on our team to make sure that they can really clear that up high level for you. So enjoy these snippets from last week's Sustainability Challenge, where you can get up to 3 hours of free continuing education. It's not too late, actually. Even though the event was last week, you can still go to sustainabilityweek.org and you can sign up, get the rest of the videos, take a couple quizzes, and get the free continuing education. So enjoy today's snippets on the Green Building Matters podcast, and make sure by the end, though, you do go sign up at sustainabilityweek.org. Enjoy.
Here's how the Sustainability Challenge will flow this week.
Today's day one. It's a State of the Sustainability Union, if you will. In our second video today, it'll be an update on all of our most popular rating systems.
Day two is all about carbon and measuring it. We're going to dive deep into that subject. Days 3 and 4 are about BIM, digital twins, and the changing requirements of owners. We're going to show you a new measurement tool, and you'll have the opportunity to see how your projects measure up.
And then day 5, we're going to put it all together. The sustainable design, construction, and operations world is rapidly changing. And we hope with some of what you learned this week, you'll be ahead of the pack. Brian, you've chosen to make a career in green buildings, energy efficiency. So let's talk about the built environment. If we zoom out, it's still a big part of our overall global greenhouse gas emissions. Can you go over some of those statistics?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we know the figures. We know the statistics about buildings. 76% of all electricity in the U.S. is going to commercial buildings. 40% of the associated greenhouse gas emissions of the entire United States. Again, the buildings, the commercial buildings we design and build. But worldwide, it's 37%. It's both a huge problem and, frankly, a very rich and focused opportunity.
And thank you for being a part of our Sustainability Week. We're going to dive into this more, but let's continue the conversation around this zoomed out problem that we have. This week we're going to talk about operating carbon and later embodied carbon, but let's talk about efficiency, which is more on the operating carbon side of things. Brian, what are some things we're focused on being more efficient on and some of the benefits of an energy efficient or just a sustainable building?
Oh, there's so many benefits. I mean, just statistically, green buildings consume 29 to 50% less energy than normal building stock, 40% less water. At the end of the day, they make 33 to 40% less carbon emissions than their standard counterparts, and they produce 50 to 70% less solid waste.
Those are big numbers.
And it's not just good by the numbers, it's literally good for business. Green buildings are lower cost to operate. Property managers, developers, investors, all those who choose to make commercial buildings more energy efficient can see huge cost savings. Building new green or even retrofitting buildings, it's fewer investments in utilities and expenses. It's financial benefits for the operators, financial benefits for the tenants. LEED buildings have 20% lower maintenance costs than their co-built counterparts. And then, of course, there are tax credits and incentives.
Green buildings also increase asset value. They retain the property values over time, depreciate less quickly, and they're more likely to meet the growing demand of discerning tenants and investors. And they typically have higher occupancy rates with rents and sales prices potentially higher above market than non-green properties. Brian, there's a lot of targets for 2030 and 2050. It might seem like that's a ways away, but But that 2031's not, and if we're not doing some things now, 2050 is going to be here before we know it. So can you kind of demystify some of these targets that are being set by entire nations or companies or even real estate companies?
You know, there's a litany of green building standards out there. Charlie's heard me say before that nobody knows what's going to end up being VHS and what's going to be Betamax by 2045 or 2030. And it's true. But in order to meet those 2030 and 2050 and other climate standards where emissions have to be reduced by 45% and be net zero in most cases by 2050, it's going to take a building sector of designers, builders, and operators who are fully committed to reaching those goals.
I like to say Blu-ray and HD DVD, Brian, and which one of those is going to win out, but I like your analogy too.
It's not just the targets that are sitting out there. At the end of the day, the conversation around environmental, social, and governance has gone from just being sort of in the fringe and corporate space to being the center spotlight, not just of the corporations, but the governments of the nations in which they operate and the general public that makes their market operations possible. They're lasered in asking, are we able to achieve the environmental, social, and governance standards that we're speaking out into the marketplace?
Absolutely, Brian. I mean, ESG is booming. It affects every business, and it affects all of you watching in different ways. You know, a simple example, if we tie it back to the built environment, maybe even a LEED project, and you need an environmental product declaration. Let's say you're a manufacturer that over the last 5 years, you've really pushed off, I don't need to do that. I don't need to have that additional cut sheet. I don't really need to put out my own ESG information. Well, now you could be losing bids because you actually don't have an EPD, an environmental product declaration, and now you're behind.
Absolutely.
So, Brian, let's talk about still kind of big picture, even legislation we're seeing by some countries, some states. Let's list off just a few. There's many, but here's what we also see in the United States towards energy efficiency and maybe even green building. So can you take us through a few of the legislative moves that we've seen stack up over the last 10 years?
No, absolutely. The tax benefits and the government incentives that give green buildings a greater opportunity are growing every day. Just a couple of months ago, the Climate Smart Buildings Initiative was funded. There's the 179D energy efficient commercial building tax deduction, the energy investment tax credits writ large, the Better Buildings Initiative, and the L Prize from the Department of Energy, and of course the accelerated recovery period for depreciation of smart meters and smart grid systems. I'm sure there's a great initialism for that one. But at the end of the day, that's just in the US. Right. There's even more legislation that we're seeing emerge across Europe and local legislation in markets around the United States. And they're driving not just opportunity, but requirements that the winning designers of tomorrow's buildings will not just have to meet, but exceed in order to win.
Make sure you're all reading up on some things happening in Europe. Like you mentioned, I was fortunate in May to go to GBCI Europe's Circle event, kind of Green Build Europe. And they really educated us on taxonomy and the European Green Deal. If you're doing the sustainability challenge with us this week, you may already know a lot of this, but we are making progress. Brian, how about on the efficiency side?
Building efficiency has been one of the most exciting spaces in the marketplace. I mean, we all know even from our home environments that we've seen an 80% jump in the energy efficiency of lighting with the transition to LED. But I was just at the Association of Energy Engineers World Conference a couple of weeks ago, and there were LEDs that were being displayed that were so efficient that I did a little quick math, and it actually would pay for itself to replace existing LEDs with those LEDs. And those efficiencies are happening in air systems, in thermal envelopes of buildings, in lighting, and then, of course, in the way that we operate the building that responds to, let's not kid ourselves, dramatic swings in occupancy that are a part of our new normal today.
There's innovations even within our green building rating system. So you're going to learn more about that in our next video with the latest with LEED and WELL and Fitwel and so many of the programs we use in all of our projects.
Not just that, but more comprehensive capabilities for calculating carbon and the carbon footprint. Our experts, Christina Bach and Nick Casanis, will be able to take us through strategies and technologies that are actually aimed at lowering our carbon footprint.
And then we're going to transition to the use of digital twins and even VR and AR. Yes, all of that coming this week in all of our bite-sized learning. Brian, so we're making progress. There's innovation left and right. There's amazing technology. There's raising the bar of building codes and energy codes. There's raising the bar of programs like LEED. It's a little harder to do LEED Platinum today than LEED Platinum 5 years ago. But how can we accelerate this, and why do we need to accelerate this?
I mean, at the end of the day, the opportunity is there, right? Today, only 1% of commercial buildings in the United States have a green certification. But the implication is that in reality, that's a small part of the overall equation. This is an opportunity that goes back to the very, very beginning. The design phase of the building is the opportunity to make the greatest impact in how we build buildings where people flourish and where the planet flourishes. You know, the further out vision is integrated systems. It's taking all of the pieces and bringing them together to achieve that next level of possibility, right? We all know that some of the best buildings are the ones where they are design build projects. And this is what we're talking about in sustainability. It's a design build sustainability. If we can apply all of the different innovations to an end-to-end process, and designing, constructing, and operating will be a lot closer to reaching our sustainability goals.
In my network, as I've built my career on green buildings, I'm fortunate to be a part of the LEED Fellow Network. With our Green Building Matters podcast, I've interviewed 250 green building professionals all over the world. I've really had a front row seat to all of these advanced topics, and we've programmed that in this week to our learning.
That's right. We know it's a complex and challenging problem. I know many of us, especially you, Charlie, have spent an entire career working to solve the problem. And I think that it's clear we're at the cusp of a major leap ahead of what is possible. So we know that most people don't have time to read, watch, and listen to everything that's out there, right? But this sustainability challenge, this is about streamlining that flood of information that's out there into content that lets you draw out the insights and the knowledge for how your firm can prepare for what's coming.
By spending this week on the Sustainability Challenge, you're getting ahead of the pack on what will be the future requirements for sustainable design, construction, and operations. I encourage you to dig in and try the new tools we're about to show you. See what you can learn on your existing projects, but don't be afraid to apply new approaches to those next projects you have access to. All right, here in part 2 of day 1 of our Sustainability Challenge, we're going to go over some rating system updates. Here we are late in 2022. What do you need to know about programs like LEED and WELL and Fitwel and more? We're not going to cover all of them. There are so many out there across the world, but we're going to pick the top 5 plus that we think you need the Cliff Notes on. So let's talk about LEED first. Many of you are LEED professionals. I've made my career around green buildings, especially LEED, but now we're getting into a lot of other rating systems too. So LEED has been around, right, for 22 years now. The first LEED projects were certified in the year 2000. Let's give you some updates though on what's happened recently and a peek at what's coming next year in 2023. So LEED on the new construction side, or LEED BD+C, Building Design and Construction. While most of your projects are still going to be doing LEED version 4, you can go ahead and pull forward some LEED version 4.1 credits, or you could do all of LEED version 4.1. Honestly, as an advanced user of LEED and our consultants at our SIG team, we like to just pull forward the best parts of LEED version 4.1 into a LEED version 4 project. So LEED for new construction, thankfully, many large corporate users are planning way ahead with their bank build-outs, with their new towers that they're building in different cities. And we're actually still seeing quite a bit of growth in the LEED BD+C rating system. A little peek ahead, though, on the LEED for new construction, because the team at the U.S. Green Building Council, and some change in leadership, has really been focused on how do we incorporate decarbonization? How do we incorporate embodied carbon? How do we incorporate equity? So yes, the next iteration of LEED, maybe it'll be called LEED version 5, kind of like iPhone, what's next? Well, LEED version 5, don't worry, won't be until late 2023, best case, But I know a lot of colleagues at the U.S. Green Building Council working hard right now, kind of getting back to some grassroots, going out to the advanced users and the new users of LEED to see how can we make this even more accommodating while raising the bar on some of these items. Again, decarbonization, embodied carbon, equity, and more. So that's a peek on the LEED for new construction side. The next major update, though, wouldn't be until late next year. LEED for existing buildings, one of my favorite programs. Some call it LEED EB, LEED EB O+M. Those in the know call it LEED EBOM. Well, really, there's two paths now to get that plaque to prove that you are operating green day to day. You can do LEED certification path, which is 110 possible points. There's prerequisites, things you have to do. Save a certain amount of energy using the Energy Star EPA tool. Save a certain amount of water in those restrooms. If you haven't changed out those porcelain toilets and urinals since the 80s, you're not going to be able to meet the prerequisite. You're going to have to do a capital project to just meet the minimum requirements. And then outside fresh air. Those are three of the early challenges to take an existing building or even a recently built building to prove to industry you operate green day to day. We are on LEED version 4 for certification path, 110 points possible, the prerequisites. But then there's also performance path. Some of you are familiar with ARC, or what we really call LEED EB version 4.1, using the ARC Scorer tool. That is really 6 main categories. It is all about actual performance. So please note, in 2022, you can earn the LEED for existing building plaque 2 ways now. Certification path, think of the 110-point scorecard, or performance path. That's where we are just inputting actual performance of that asset in order to recertify every 3 years for ARC, or every 5 years, up to 5 years for LEED EB certification path. You still have to make sure you're operating your buildings green day to day. So let's talk about healthy buildings, or what I like to call wellness real estate. 6-7 years ago, we saw Well and Fitwel, only one L on that side, come on the scene. These two programs are not related to LEED. However, if you've done a LEED project, you have about a 30+% head start into these wellness programs. Well, full plaque, okay, is where we design and build and could even operate a healthy building, a healthy space. We have medical research from the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, the Well Living Lab, all behind that program. Again, think a full comprehensive certification with an actual testing in the field by the Well Performance Testing Agent and the Well Assessor team. At the same time, though, we saw Fitwel, Fitwel. This is CDC-backed research, very good program, even more about getting your occupants of your building up, moving, and having some healthy policies in place. So we've seen both Well and Fitwel move from their version 1s, younger, healthy building programs, onto their next iteration to their version 2s or 2+. But what happened, right? Over the last 2.5 years, we had a pandemic. Once the pandemic set in, both of these programs, even LEED a little bit, came out with a pandemic response program. So we have Well Health Safety Rating, or Well HSR, which we focus on 25 best practice opportunities and policies. You have to earn 17 out of the 25 in order to get a seal. So when you walk into your building, some of you, of course, returning to work, maybe in a hybrid 2-3 days a week, and you see a seal that says Well Health Safety Rating, you know that they've done a great job with their pandemic response. Fitwel has Fitwel Viral Response Module, VRM, which is very similar. These are pandemic response programs that we don't want to just do when there's a pandemic. We want to keep up these best practices over time. You do have to recertify these seals every year, and that's what we're working on with some of our portfolio real estate clients right now. We did this during the pandemic. Are we going to keep it up? And thankfully, we're seeing a lot of our real estate portfolios, yes. We're going to keep up these seals. Let's get our buildings reoccupied. So to recap, Well and Fitwel, full certification, going strong with new buildings, new tenant buildouts, and especially existing multi-tenant on the Fitwel full certification side. But the seals, you're still going to see those. Some properties just now proving, yes, see, this is a healthy place to come back to work, but you have to recertify the seals every year, and the certifications, the full plaques over here, every 3 years. Next, let's talk about GRESB or GRESB. Frankly, the industry actually calls it out both ways. So with GRESB, in the simplest of terms, how green is your portfolio? A lot of our real estate clients want to attract investors and really have to prove, here's what we do to make this a green portfolio, but not just our impact, right? Our quantitative side of things, energy, water, waste, impact of the buildings in that portfolio, but also the qualitative side, the policy side, how we run things, how we make decisions, even extra points for how your board of directors is compensated for sustainability decisions. So we're seeing tremendous growth with those portfolios. It's optional that report into GRESB. So your portfolio, your fund can be scored. We've seen in the last few years a couple of new modules around healthy buildings and around resiliency that have been added to GRESB. And now you have to answer those questions. Now they will be scored. And so that's a good example of not just one building at a time earning a LEED plaque, earning an Energy Star certification, earning a WELL or Fitwel plaque. We still, of course, as we've just updated you, have to focus there one asset at a time. But now this can start aggregating. And the more of your portfolio that has earned one of these certifications, the more actually points you can get within one of the sections within GRESB. But don't forget, there is still the quantitative side of GRESB. We've added up those certifications, but at the end of the day, no matter what, even if you don't have the plaques, save energy, save water, improve your recycling, on down the list of the actual impact and greenhouse gas emissions tied to your real estate. That, of course, is one of the biggest chunks of points you're going to get as your portfolio is scored within GRESB. At SIG, we've actually broken out our ESG team. We've been building a bigger team around just that initiative. Because frankly, if you were to ask me, hey, Charlie, is there a LEED rule book for the world? Over the last 5 years, I'd say, well, no. I would have told you to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Pick 3 or 4 that are important to your company out of the 17 UN SDGs and align with that. Many companies do, many real estate portfolios do. Heck, entire Fortune 100 companies, entire cities will not only align with the Paris Climate Accord, even when maybe your country gets off of that, depending on leadership, and then get back on that. It's really come down to the UN SDGs. So make sure you're reading up on that. But I'd say new territory, as you've seen a tremendous amount of legislation. We talked about that in video 1 around ESG. So something like GRESB, a program like that, where you actually are getting scored, is you as a real estate portfolio putting yourself out there to get scored on your ESG, but across the portfolio and your operations. We also do work and have other programs like CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, TCFD, and many more that you'll want to read up on if you're involved with portfolio, real estate, or just corporate sustainability. New to our Cliff Notes that we bring to all of you is actually BREEAM or BREEAM. It's said both ways. Believe it or not, BRE in the UK and BREEAM was first started in 1990. So it was actually out there before LEED. Some might say that, LEED mimicked BREEAM a little bit. Here's the reality. In the US, BREEAM US didn't come out until about 2016. But I would argue that the US Green Building Council and LEED, quite the brand that I'm a fan of, if you can't tell, they kept BREEAM out for a long time. But I think it's safe to say there have been some projects over the last 5-6 years, but in the last 18 to 24 months, for our large portfolio clients, they are asking for BREEAM, not just as an alternative to LEED, but as they attract European and international investors that are used to BREEAM, they want some of their assets in the United States to earn that certification instead. So I think a trend we're seeing is while some new buildings in the US may be going for a BREEAM certification, I'd say that's a little smaller. It's picking up. It's the BREEAM in use or existing buildings that we are seeing quite a bit of popularity around. It's a good program. We could argue comparable on overall price. It has different phases, different stages, but just know a few cliff notes here. You can go from an acceptable building, kind of 1 star, to an outstanding building, 6 stars. Now, for a little more information about BREEAM, especially here in the US, we're going to put some resources here that you can go read up more. So on Friday, when we close out, we're going to show you what's next. But what's imminent, what's happening right now that maybe is not already written into programs like LEED or WELL or GRESB? It's some topics we're going to hit on this week in the Sustainability Challenge. For example, tomorrow, we're going to talk all about carbon, the difference between operating carbon and efficiency, embodied carbon on the material side, the supply chain, even during construction. We'll talk a little bit this week about net zero buildings and where there's mandates lining up. But as we take a look at what's next for LEED, they are going to force you down the road, I'll shoot the messenger, to have a net zero readiness plan. That's going to come to us probably later next year with programs like LEED. So stay tuned. Thanks for being a part of the challenge. We'll see you tomorrow, all about carbon.
All right, welcome to day 2. You got through day 1. Charlie, they got through day 1. It wasn't that hard, was it?
I'm so glad we've put this together. This has just been a blast already.
In day 1, you learned about the sweeping changes coming to design and construction and the rating systems. And today I'm wearing a jacket because we're going to get serious. Today's all about carbon. We've got 2 great subject matter experts for these videos.
We've got Nick Casanas. He's president of Sustainable Investment Group, just an expert with all things LEED, commissioning, energy modeling, and more. And we've also got Christina Bach. She's the co-founder of Blue Ocean Sustainability, licensed architect, has all of the LEED credentials, and really is one of the foremost experts on embodied carbon. And again, we're diving deep today, all about carbon.
After you've watched the videos, you can take the quiz, which is 10 questions. It's the first of 2 quizzes that you'll get if you're going to be going for the LEED and AIA continuing ed credits. Just a reminder, leave us the comments and we'll respond as we see them.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Sustainability Challenge. My name is Christina Bach. I'm the president and founder of Blue Ocean Sustainability. I'm joined today by Nick Casanas, the president of Sustainable Investment Group, and we're going to take you through the evolution of the carbon story. So when most people think about a building life cycle or lifespan, they tend to think of it in this very linear fashion, where it spends a couple of years in design, a couple of years getting constructed, and then the majority of the life of that building, it's just in the standard operation phase, just kind of chugging along, people using it. It's, turning the lights on, heating the building, cooling the building, et cetera, until eventually, after 60 plus years or so, it gets demolished. The challenge is that buildings don't really operate in that sort of very consistent linear fashion. If you think about it, buildings are much more like living things. Their needs change, their uses change, and they're constantly kind of readapting to what the needs of their occupants are. An example of that is the Dryads Market in New Orleans. It was built in 1849 as sort of a grocery food market where people could come and get fresh produce, meats, et cetera, to serve their basic needs. It operated in that capacity for over 100 years until the 1970s when it was readapted into a big box retail store. Still a retail use, but very different space needs in terms of, what they were selling. There wasn't the refrigeration needs that a grocery store had. Different sort of wares and goods required different needs and systems of the building. Additionally, then, about 40 years later, it was readapted again and went through a major renovation to become an entertainment space. It's the New Orleans Jazz Market, a LEED certified theater. So it's about 350 people or so and hosts a variety of different musical sort of performances. And if you think about it, over the course of the 150 plus years of this building, think about all the systems that have changed. We've had internet has come out, all the different technologies that have come up, in addition to just the needs and the use and the focus of that building changing. So realistically, that sort of idea that building just kind of gets built once and then just operates in that standard format doesn't really make sense with how we see buildings used today. Instead, we really see this idea that, as buildings are living things, well, there's a lot of products and materials that go in during the construction phase. From a carbon standpoint, you can't negate the fact that there is still material carbon changes happening in the operational phase that you need to think about as well. I'm going to turn it over to Nick now to talk a little bit more, do a deeper dive into decarbonization strategies and operational strategies that are out there today.
Thank you, Christina. There are many industry terms around building decarbonization today. It is important to go over some definitions to help us understand what the current conversation around carbon and decarbonization is. Decarbonization is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in building construction and operation. We see an emphasis in moving away from on-site fossil fuel combustion, such as natural gas and fuel oil, and a transition to electrification, all with the end goal of utilizing a green electric grid that is built for resiliency. Operational carbon takes into account the emissions budget of a building during its operational life cycle. That includes total energy consumption, distribution of water from the municipality, and refrigerant, which is often overlooked in our eagerness to transition to heat pumps. Although the goal is to reduce overall internal loads and the building's energy use intensity, there is inevitably a minimum threshold of energy consumption needed to operate buildings. The question is, do we offset with on-site renewables or off-site emissions-free energy sources? The difference between these two scenarios is a net zero energy building versus a net zero carbon building, respectively. Ideally, we are choosing our site location, building orientation, and overall footprint such that we have enough on-site renewable energy opportunities to offset the total annual energy consumption of the building. Alternatively, we look to take advantage of regional or national renewable energy sources where there's an abundance due to weather conditions or geographic significance. These are the carbon offsets that can account for the excess emissions generated on-site. Not every new construction project can take advantage of on-site renewable energy, especially in the built environment where we have a massive stock of existing buildings that don't have that convenience. Let's talk about building decarbonization trends. Climate disasters are increasing and the federal and state governments are responding nationwide. A growing number of financial drivers for building decarbonization are coalescing. California, for example, has made strides with electrification and decarbonization incentives and codes, whereas New York City and Boston have established local laws setting upper limits on building greenhouse gas emissions, which will be in place by 2024 and beyond. It is not enough to reduce energy consumption and develop on-site renewables, though. While the operational carbon is a major focus, the generation and distribution of electricity is still lagging. Parallel to building decarbonization, there needs to be a concerted effort to decarbonize the electric grid as well. Moving to 100% electric can prove to be a resiliency issue when the grid cannot handle the load. The last thing we want is for another coal-fired power plant to have to turn on during peak demand because our buildings are straining the grid. That is today's reality. One way we can make an impact during the design phase or when analyzing an existing building is through energy modeling. Energy modeling plays a major role in helping establish and define net zero energy goals. For new construction, energy models can prove to be key tools in selecting site location, building orientation, facade design, and more. Through the integrated design process and through parametric analysis of these components, we can determine the optimal design in collaboration with the architect and engineers of record. Utilizing weather normalized data, energy models can help predict what the operational carbon footprint of a building will be during design. For existing buildings, we're working with utility bill data to calibrate our models and how the buildings currently operate. This allows the team to identify inefficiencies in operation and ways to improve both the design and sequence of operations. Massive retrofit projects and opportunities to electrify the building can be simulated to determine feasibility and return on investments. It is clear that these tools can lead to better understanding of current and future operational carbon. What is measured can be improved upon. The pathway to net zero for buildings starts with determining a base system design and looking to improve on each aspect of that design. These iterative improvements can include the architectural design with overhangs and shading, the mechanical design with HVAC system selection and efficiency, and leveraging the building envelope and occupancy scheduling to reduce overall internal load. This methodology allows for the right sizing of equipment and avoidance of excess materials and costs during construction. The last piece of the puzzle, once we've identified all feasible and cost-effective ways to reduce our peak demand and overall energy use intensity, is to identify on-site and off-site renewable energy offsets. As we wrap up our discussion around operational carbon, let's take a look at the loading order for decarbonization. Leveraging energy modeling best practices and the latest technology and innovations, our first goal is to have an efficient design that targets load reductions and electrification. Once we have established the most efficient design based on the project resources, we'll want to maximize the site footprint for on-site renewables such as solar, wind, hydro, or geothermal. After we've exhausted all efforts for on-site renewables, the next step is to procure off-site renewables either via power purchasing agreements, green tariffs, or other means. Lastly, what we can't procure on-site or regionally, we can offset with renewable energy credits and carbon offsets. The need to decarbonize buildings is urgent, but it's only one piece of the embodied carbon puzzle. I'll turn it back to Christina for a look at carbon impacts through the complete building cycle.
So, as we know, embodied carbon is officially the carbon dioxide associated with the emissions of all the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of the building materials. It's supposed to include the carbon impacts of those materials all the way through the product stage, through its use, and all the way up until its end of life, whether it's recycled or disposed of, whatever that might be. But as we talked about, this idea that material changes and carbon and embodied carbon changes throughout the phases, embodied carbon and operational carbon are really two things that you need to be looking at all points in the design construction process. When we look at carbon impacts by phase, for example, during the design phase, you should really be looking at both embodied and operational carbon in terms of forecasting. The embodied carbon is heavily driven by what materials you're evaluating, what you're specifying, what you're putting into your design as your basis for what the contractor should be using to build that building. Additionally, your operational carbon, this is when you're forecasting what do you think it's going to use in terms of its energy and water once the building is up and running and people are occupying that space. When you move into the construction phase, it's when you start getting into those real actuals and basically checking your work or checking your sort of assumptions. For embodied carbon, this is heavily driven by your materials. Material procurement is a big one. And this is really when you want to capture that actual A1 through A3 scope. As we know, a lot of times what we specify and select as our basis of design doesn't always make it into our construction projects. We've all had the case of a contractor substituting some product or material for something else. So it's really important when we get to that construction phase that we're actually going back and checking what materials have been put in and what is that carbon impact, because it might be higher, it might be lower. Additionally, you should be really paying close attention to what the installation process looks like for your contractor. The A4 and A5 scope can vary widely depending on where your project is located, what sort of equipment your contractor is using, what are their standard practices for reducing waste and things like that. So that's something that really needs to be carefully tracked at your job site as you're going through construction. And that goes into the whole idea of construction waste. A lot of people tend to think about waste in terms of just diverted from landfill percentages, how much could you recycle? What they fail to think about or account for is the fact that even waste that is recycled has carbon impacts associated with it. When you're hauling that waste away, you're going to have all those transportation emissions, whether it's going to a recycling plant, whether it's going to a landfill. Additionally, if you're hauling off concrete, for example, that you're going to reuse, but it needs to be ground up, you have all that energy associated with that equipment that grinds it up and turns it into a new product that could be reused. So there are carbon impacts for diversion methods. Every diversion method, whatever that might be, does have a carbon impact. And it's really important to evaluate not just is it getting diverted from landfill or not, but how am I diverting it and what's the carbon impact of that process? Or might there be alternative options available to me in my location that might be more carbon effective or efficient? When we get to the operations phase, operational carbon becomes the thing that everyone kind of thinks about. They understand it, that the building is now up and running. You're going to be tracking your energy consumption in terms of water, waste, fuels, et cetera, at that operational level. What does it take to actually use the building? The challenge is that embodied carbon is still this kind of progressively growing carbon footprint. Embodied carbon doesn't necessarily go away or change. And while the amount of, sort of changes that it undergoes will decrease, it doesn't completely get eliminated. So the initial impact of what you spent in your in terms of carbon cost to build the building does decrease kind of on a year-over-year basis as the building lifespan ages. However, when you start getting into those material replacements, the upgrades, you're doing new tenant fit outs, new construction work, just maintenance, you're going to paint at some point, you're going to replace the carpet at some point. All of those have material carbon impacts, waste carbon impacts, et cetera, that really change what that material sort of embodied footprint of the building is. It's not a static one and done sort of process or evaluation when the building's completed initially. And when we move towards the final sort of, stage or end of life for our buildings and we start to demolish them, whether that's being disassembled and, recycling or going straight to landfill sort of a process, we really want to be looking at the final results. What was our holistic carbon impact for that project throughout its entire lifespan? We're looking at the embodied carbon of that material is based on how did we actually divert them? Not how did we think we could divert them or what might have been recoverable, but what did we actually do with those materials when we took that building down? So that we can come up with kind of that full scope, holistic look at how much carbon did that building use across its entire lifespan, and how accurate were we against our initial predictions in that design phase. I hope you'll join us in our next class later today for talking about embodied carbon analysis, how it currently works and why it needs to have a reboot, some of the challenges that go into the current calculation method. Thanks so much for joining us.